Hello, thank you so much for organizing this workshop. I am honored to have this opportunity to make a presentation. I am Mai Sugimoto, working as an associate professor at the Faculty of Sociology, Kansai University. My specialty is history of science and technology, and I have been researching the history of computing and artificial intelligence, especially its early history, including the period before the term artificial intelligence was coined. The results of my research have been published in my book, 人工知能前夜, Artificial Intelligence If, in 2018, although it's written in Japanese. And I also have an English paper on Alan Turing, co-authored with erudition Katsuhiko-san. I am not a philosopher, but today, as a historian, I would like to discuss the topic of the mind of machines. My research on the history of artificial intelligence is a historical examination of why computers have been likened to the brain. Computers, often referred to as electric brain, even in Japanese or Chinese, are often compared to the brain, and websites, articles, and magazines about AI are frequently accompanied by pictures of the brain glowing with blue phosphorescence. Many people take this for granted because nowadays machine learning based on neural networks, including deep learning, has achieved remarkable success in areas such as image processing and gaming, and therefore AI or computer must resemble brains. People tend to think in this way. However, the analogy between computers and brains began long before the term artificial intelligence was coined. Throughout history, when new types of machines are invented, magazine articles, books, and researchers have tried to use metaphors, likening them to humans and human organs in order to explain their function or detailed features. Their anthropomorphisms and metaphors have had a profound impact on the arguments that machines have or do not have minds. One of the points of this presentation is that AI research was born as an evolving dissolution of interdisciplinary research using its metaphor and analogy. And also, we should not forget that, as you know, the development of AI research since the second half of the 20th century has expanded beyond such metaphors and anthropomorphisms. In other words, AI researchers and the people who use AI may no longer need to anthropomorphize such machines. For example, people who use Google Translate or shop using Amazon do not think Google Translate or Amazon as humans. It is often said that AI is and has been an attempt to understand the human mind, but this is only partially true, and from a historical point of view, it should be said that this is a too casual understanding. If AI research has evolved into a realm beyond the metaphor and anthropomorphism, then we need to objectively analyze why we need to discuss the issue of AI and mind that is based on the anthropomorphism, which is no longer inevitable. There is a historical background to the fact that certain computer programs and robots which can move autonomously are called AI, and they have come to be associated with human reasoning ability. Today, I would like to talk briefly about the historical origins of AI. I hope this will help make the discussion about the mind of AI more relevant to the historical context. The expression comparing machines to the brain can be seen from the beginning of the 20th century, before the advent of digital electronic computers. In magazine articles for the general public, the brain was used as a metaphor to help readers understand newly invented complex machines. These photos are from before the Second World War. Digital computers first appeared in the mid 1940s, so they did not yet exist at this time, although they were electromechanical digital calculators. The machines introduced with explanation use these metaphors were not necessarily digital machines. They are devices equipped with optical sensors, control devices with sub-function, and analog computers such as differential analyzers like these. Then in the 1940s, when the high-speed electronic digital computer was invented, the computers was likened to the brain. This was based on the idea that the function of the new machines were similar to the role which the brain and nervous system played in human bodies. However, since they were a magazine article for the general public, these explanations were not academically accurate. Although this was a very simple analogy, and there was no in-depth discussion of what kind of thinking such machines could have. These metaphors were introduced into research in earnest in 1940s through cybernetics initiated by Norbert Wiener. Cybernetics is a research movement that originally began with mathematician Norbert Wiener and his collaborators who focused on feedback mechanisms. They pointed out that there is feedback in both the control mechanisms of machines and the nervous system of living organisms, and studied an interdisciplinary research movement ranging from electromechanical engineering to neurophysiology to understand the mechanism of both. Wiener and his collaborators organized interdisciplinary meetings called the Macy Conferences. Wiener's famous book, Cybernetics, was written through this movement. This influence of cybernetics remains today, most notably in the term cyber. The cybernetics movement of the late 1940s was a specialized research project conducted in collaboration with various experts such as mathematicians, engineers, biologists, neurophysiologists, psychiatrists, sociologists, and so on. Wiener himself was interested in feedback mechanism and prosthetics in particular. Among those who were interested in engineering approaches, there were researchers, especially in the United Kingdom, who were interested in control engineering and computer engineering, as well as in small robots, that is, automatic machines equipped with sensors. One of those researchers is Ross Ashby. Ashby was a psychiatrist, and in 1948, he created Homeostat, an analog device that realized feedback by combining iron wires, magnets, water tanks, and so on, with the concept of imitating the function of the brain that maintained homeostasis. Greywater, who was a neurophysiologist, is known to have built a number of small autonomous robots called tortoises in the late 1940s and 1950s. Some of them were equipped with optical sensors. As we will see later, the mathematician Alan Turing had a close relationship with these British cybernetic researchers. In this cybernetic movement, neurophysiologist Warren McCulloch and Rajesh Waterpit published research which became a basis for connection between computers and brains. In their 1943 paper, A Logical Calculus of the Idea Immanent in Nervous Activity, they modeled neural network of brain to allow representation of symbolic logic and discussed how the network behaves. The model dealt with in this paper was later reformulated by Stephen Kleene as a finite automaton. In this paper, McCulloch and Pitt cited Alan Turing's 1936 paper on computable numbers. In this paper, Turing argues that the so-called Turing thesis, that is, any effective or mechanical method is computable by a Turing machine program. Computing in terms of the effective method is computing in which in principle can be performed by a person with paper, a pencil, and an eraser without any insight or ingenuity. A Turing machine is an abstract machine that read, write, and erase symbols on an infinitely long tape according to a given table of rules. In this paper, Turing gave a negative solution to the Entscheidungs problem. One of the goals of McCulloch and Pitts was to provide a kind of justification for Church Turing's thesis by using an abstract model of the brain. It seems that McCulloch and Pitts were trying to create a neural network model that could compute Turing computable numbers, although they failed and it ended up finite automata in reality. However, their paper played an important role in the early development of automata theory. This paper gave Stephen Kleene the motivation to devise his famous regular expression and formalize the neural network model as a finite automaton. And through this paper, von Neumann learned of the assumption that the behavior of neurons can be simplified, which provided the basis for the analogy between digital computers and brains. Here, I would like to talk about von Neumann, who published a number of articles related to the computer and brains. As you know, von Neumann is a very famous mathematician and physicist who contributed to various fields such as quantum mechanics, game theory, development of the atomic bombs, and digital high-speed computers. Von Neumann joined the Massey conferences and the cybernetic research group because he learned from Wiener about the McCulloch and Pitts paper. Von Neumann's motivation was not only to help explain the new invention of computers, but also his own intellectual curiosity about the similarities in the function of elements of digital computers and brains. He repeatedly discussed the comparison between brains and computers in his lectures, assuming the neural model of McCulloch and Pitts. He wanted to do, quote, comparing two unknown objects, unquote. According to his transcripts, von Neumann wanted to eventually approach the brain not as an abstract model, but as a real physical entity, because simplification and idealization could overlook the details. However, the real brain is too complex to study, so he says he made abstractions. Apparently, he had an ambition to reconstruct a brain or a living body by using physical machine parts. However, he passed away before that prospect came. Overall, the cybernetics research group focused on two things: the analogy between the organisms with nervous system, including sensory and motor nerves, and machines with control mechanisms, and the analogy between central nervous system or brains as networks of neural elements and digital computers. The researchers who focused on the former were motivated by a desire to understand the mechanisms of nervous system and living organisms. The devices with optical sensors and control mechanisms, which I mentioned, were built by them with this background. On the other hand, the discussion related to the central nervous system and computers was developed with great impact from the work of McCulloch Pitts. This was based on the idea that the brain and computer may be similar in structure at the microscopic level, and then this may be related to the reasoning ability of the brains. Von Neumann, already a famous researcher at the time, gave various lectures based on this idea, and younger researchers who were influenced by him eventually set an agenda for the AI research. In any case, in the era of cybernetics, it was more or less common among researchers to think that in order for machines to have the same function as the human or animal brain, it would be sufficient to physically realize a structure analogous to that of the brain and nervous system. These cybernetics researchers of the 1940s and early 1950s were a generation ahead of John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky, who organized the Dartmouth Conference and are now considered pioneers in AI research. McCarthy listened to von Neumann's lecture on the analogy between the brain and the computer at a symposium held at Caltech in September 1948, and in 1949 discussed with von Neumann the finite automaton model of the human brain. Meanwhile, around 1949, Minsky invented a machine that had neuron synapses and memory circuit to memorize and learn from past behaviors. Based on the experience in making this machine, he wrote his dissertation on the theory of machines with circuits that remember given stimuli. One of the judges for his dissertation was von Neumann. It is clear that the first generation researchers of AI were greatly influenced by the previous cybernetic paradigm. However, they questioned the idea of the previous generation researchers. That is, they already did not think it was possible to build a real machine which imitated the central nervous system. In order to build such a machine, thousands or tens of thousands of elements corresponding to neurons were required, and apparently it was too huge to construct. This is probably the reason why McCarthy and other researchers changed the direction of their research to the idea of realizing the intellectual function of the brain by well configuring computer programs. In other words, the agenda of the first generation of AI research did not continue the idea of cybernetic researchers, but had their influence and the reflection of them. Another thing to discuss in exploring the early history of AI is Alan Turing. There were three well-known researches by Turing: Turing machine, Turing test, and Turing pattern. In particular, the study of computational model called the Turing machine later became the basis of computer science. Together with his article on machine intelligence, including the paper on Turing test, it had had a certain impact on the subsequent research on AI and the philosophy surrounding it. Now, we have already mentioned that Turing's paper in 1936 had an influence on McCulloch and Pitts. Turing himself, as early as in several articles from 1945 to 1948, asked the question, what kind of behavior does a machine have to consider to be intelligent? In addition to it, Turing also discusses the problem of organizing a computer which can learn from experience by modifying its own programs, and the problem of organizing a network composed of certain standard units that can receive interference stimuli from the outside. I will not go into detail today since time is limited, but in his 1948 report, Turing stated that intelligence required discipline and initiative. Discipline is an ability to learn a given set of rules and to work according to them. Calculation by effective method, which can be done by Turing machine, is an example. This kind of discipline is essential for intelligence, but it is not enough. And what is needed in addition is initiative. According to Turing, a typical task that required initiative is intellectual searches or heuristic searches. One example is the problem of finding integers with a certain property. This task, which requires initiative, may not be Turing computable. Therefore, it can be said that Turing believed that human intelligence may have the ability to do tasks which Turing machine cannot perform. Machines could acquire this kind of discipline and initiative by learning, Turing suggested. However, it should be noted that these articles were probably not published until around 1968. It is not clear whether Turing's idea influenced on the connectionism, for example. While the work on Turing machine was very technical, the paper Computer Machinery and Intelligence was rather easy to read, although it discusses the relationship between the configuration of digital computers and Turing's computational model and learning machines, an imitation game, and the so-called Turing test. This paper was published in the philosophy journal Mind. The detail of imitation game has already been discussed by various researchers, so I will not discuss them here. What I would like to examine is how this paper was treated in the early days of AI research, especially by the organizer of the Dartmouth conferences. The clue is in this collections paper called Automata Studies. The organizers of the 1956 Dartmouth conference published these automata studies at almost the same time as the conference. The Dartmouth conference was organized by McCarthy, Minsky, Nathaniel Rochester of IBM, and Claude Shannon, famous for information theory. Automata Studies was published as a special issue of the Annals of Mathematics Study, co-edited by McCarthy and Shannon, prior to the planning of the Dartmouth Conference. A call for paper sent in 1953 said, quote, "We are interested in papers dealing with such topics: learning machines, nerve networks, self-reproducing machines, and an organization of computing machines for learning processes, adaptive behavior, and reasoning," unquote. It seemed to give us a glimpse of the direction of AI research after the Dartmouth Conference. This letter was sent to researchers, including cybernetic researchers such as Wiener and Ashby. It was also sent to Turing, but he wrote back that, quote, "Unfortunately, I have been working on something quite different for the last 2 years, namely the mathematics for morphogenesis, though I expect to get back to cybernetics very shortly," unquote. However, Turing passed away in 1954, and he never returned to cybernetics again. The whole automata studies can be divided into three parts, each containing papers related to research on finite automata, Turing machines, and cybernetics-derived research on imitating living organisms with machines. What I want to focus on is its preface. One-third of the preface of automata studies is devoted to the definition of thought that Turing allegedly gave in computing machinery and intelligence. Quote, "Among the most challenging scientific questions of our time are the corresponding analytic and synthetic problems. How does a brain function? Can we design a machine which will simulate a brain? The problem of giving precise definition to the concept of thinking and of deciding whether or not a given machine is capable of thinking has aroused a great deal of heated discussion. One interesting definition has been proposed by A.M. Turing. A machine is termed capable of thinking if it can, under certain prescribed conditions, imitate a human being by answering questions sufficiently well to deceive a human questioner for a reasonable period of time. A definition of this type has the advantage of being operational or, in the psychologist's term, behavioristic. No metaphysical notion of consciousness, ego, and the like are involved. While certainly no machines at the present time can even make a start at a few decades, it will be possible to program general purpose computers in such a way as to satisfy this test. A disadvantage of the Turing definition of thinking is that it is possible, in principle, to design a machine with a complete set of arbitrarily chosen response to all possible input stimuli. See this volume, the Robertson and Kleene papers. Such a machine, in a sense, for any given input situation, including past history, merely look up in a dictionary the appropriate response. With a suitable dictionary, such a machine would surely satisfy Turing's definition but does not reflect our usual intuitive concept of thinking. Unquote. The imitation game have been discussed many times since 1980s, and there is controversy about whether Turing really gave a definition of thought or not, but I will not discuss it here. This passage is a kind of counter-argument to Imitation Game by Shannon and McCarthy. That is, a machine with a dictionary that contains all the appropriate answers will theoretically succeed in imitation games, but simply looking up the dictionary and returning the answers may not be thinking. This statement may be the origin of the most prevalent interpretation of imitation games today. In particular, the expression often used today, such as test and behavioristic, are the same as they are now, and it could suggest that interpretation and explanation of the Turing test have been reproduced since the 1950s. The idea that machines think is a metaphor and anthropomorphism. Turing's work in 1930 was to model human computational ability in the first place, and in AI research, Turing's work became the basis of the discussion through automaton theory. It can be said that metaphor and anthropomorphism were already lurking in the background of the first research agenda of AI. Due to my limited time, I can hardly discuss the history of AI after the 1950s. As you know, roughly speaking, AI has had three major booms. The first one from the late 1950s to the early 1970s, the second one in the 1980s after the so-called AI winter, and the third one in the 21st century. It is important to note that each boom or hype was supported by funding, including DARPA in the United States. In the second and third boom, corporate funding was also went into AI research. This expanded the scope of the technology called AI, both commercially and academically. In the 1980s, there was an anecdote that if AI was put into practical use, it would no longer be called AI. There was even a perception that AI could never be commercialized. However, in the 21st century, with increasing power of computers, AI technology has been put to practical use, and in the practical realm of AI, there are many people and companies who are not interested in philosophical realms. This is one of the reasons why the good old awareness of the problem of anthropomorphization of machines is no longer shared by some of current AI researchers and AI users. It should be noted that throughout the history of AI from the 1960s to 2010s, in most cases, it has not been set as a realistic goal of research to enable computers to think and behave like humans in a comprehensive manner. The technology now called AI does not reproduce the overall intelligence of humans, nor does it reproduce the human brain. It does only part of the kind of work that humans do with their brain, whether or not it is possible for a living human being. I'd like to conclude. Through the evolving dissolution of the cybernetic paradigm, researchers in the 1950s gave the name AI to a system that could perform natural language processing, image recognition, and proof. And then throughout the history, with the background of machine brain metaphor, magazine and article describing future prospect fantastically depicted machines that could think and behave like humans. This history implicitly supports the problematic notion that AI is likened to the mind and brain. Thank you so much.